My earliest memories as a child, it wasn't uncommon for the lake to be a blue colour. Now the majority of the time it's discoloured, i.e. it's dirty. It's not as healthy as what it once was.
We had stacks of A-frames here when I was a child. The eels were opened up, salted, and then placed on there to dry out. There's a lot of things like that my children don't even know about.
Pretty much our whole life speaking about the moana, singing about the moana, and doing and learning about the traditions of our moana, but not having any physical kind of connection to it.
These waters of ours look very, very different, and so you have to apply the stories of our past to really understand what we've lost.
Do I leave my ancestor to die, or do I do something about it?
They're behind us.
Lovely to see.
Oh, you got lost? I did.
Oh, you did?
Hello.
This is my ancestor. And when I think about Wairarapa Moana in terms of that, our own identity is linked with our lake and our moana. If our identity it can only be fully expressed when we are allowed to be fully expressed. Anything before then isn't who you fully are.
Yeah, but I know they don't actually bite you. I'm a bit okay with it.
Well, I used to come down here all the time when I was a kid, and my grandmother used to make a point of it. And we'll go to the different spots around the lake that they had access to back then. But we were always told to be careful of the fence posts because I don't know, do they still have barbed wire on it? They say you can go play in it. It's like, but just be careful of the barbed wire.
I grew up out that way at a place called Whatarangi, Cape Palliser, and my family are fishermen out there, and this is my home.
I grew up around this area, this part of the Wairarapa. We spent a lot of time at Lake Onoke. We spent a lot of our childhood down there gathering kai. As an adult, now I see the importance of those activities that we did as a whānau. However, now we're very selective on where we do gather that kai before we could trust the water.
In the 50s, we used to come down. I didn't tell you my birthday, did I? I would have been about 6 or 7. I can remember most of the times up to that, so it was just a fun place to be, coming down here at the lake. And we'd have tents up, but we didn't have the nice flash tents that my grandchildren have now. It was just a tarpaulin over the top of between cars.
in the rivers. We would take kayaks down to the Ruamahanga River with my dad and my cousin and me paddling down there, and I think my cousin flipped his kayak over and got stuck under a log. Yeah, other times we would take the kayaks down to Lake Wairarapa and try and paddle there. I actually don't know if we actually got to use the kayaks much because we'd always arrive there and it would be so windy.
So both my parents are from here. I was born in Martinborough, which is just across the way somewhere. Mid-1950s, my family packed us all up and we moved to a place called Mangakino, in the middle of the North Island, and it was the land that was meant to have been a reserve when our tipuna gifted Wairarapa Moana, what's here, to the Crown. We were meant to get a reserve near Lake Onoke. The Crown didn't have enough savings to do that, offered us some land elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in kaupapa Māori medium education. The kura that I went to was the kura kaupapa Māori of Wairarapa. So for my whole life I've known Wairarapa as a part of my identity. I mean, my identity is fully kind of derived from the Moana itself.
My upbringing's perhaps a little different from most Kiwi kids, I guess. My whakapapa, or my genealogy, is certainly from Ireland, Scotland. My dad immigrated to New Zealand in the early 70s. He arrived to a place called Wairarapa here. They somehow became entwined with the kohanga reo movement. The language of Māori was slowly but consistently being lost. So the strategy was to teach the babies, start with early childhood, and this is called kohanga reo. My little sister's first language was Māori. So I grew up a bit of a confused child. I actually thought I was Māori. Despite my white skin and my Irish heritage, I firmly believed I was Māori.
I've had a lot of very, very rich, strong memories of this place growing up as a child. And now in my later years, as an adult now, I still have that same affinity to the place. I still have that emotional and spiritual connection to the place, and that's why I spend so much time out here. But one of the biggest stories around here that everybody will be talking to you about would be with regards to the tuna or the eels that are here. And this area was known to supply not only the rest of Wairarapa with the bounty that you could get from harvesting the eels in the lake, but also outside of the Wairarapa area as well, where it was traded as a commodity.
I don't know if you have a favourite grandmother or a favourite older person, but any time you go around to their place, they usually feed you up too well and really spoil you. That's what our lakes were like for us.
You'll find out from a lot of other people that it wasn't uncommon to see evidence of eels that have been harvested at certain times of the year. The area would just be littered with eels that have been processed and were drying out, ready for not only to feed the local community, but a lot of other areas outside of Wairarapa.
We had stacks of A-frames here when I was a child. The eels were opened up, salted, and then placed on there to dry out. That was our winter feed. And when we go inland, we would share that with the inland people, and they would share out back to us their food supply. So there's a lot of things like that my children don't even know about.
My first job as a kid was as a commercial eel fisherman, and one of my favourite memories from those times was fishing on the Ruamahanga River. There's a gorge halfway between Masterin and Pukaha, and we got in early in the morning before the sunrise, floated down in a dinghy, and the gorge is filled with crystal clear, beautiful, clean water. And we set about 3 or 4 nets in this gorge and didn't catch much, but we had to swim down to the net to pick the hinaki up. And on the last net, there was only one eel in there, but it was a big eel, and I swam down with a snorkel and just had a moment, just a quiet moment underwater, face to face with this kaumatua, because it would have been at least 60, 70 years old. And when you are in their world, it makes you perceive the world differently. In that moment, she was looking at me and I was looking at her, and I felt, I don't know, I felt at home. I felt a perspective of kind of like a mirror world of ours, you know. I was flying, and I just, I don't know, I'll just never forget that moment. It feels like yesterday when I think about it. It's part of who I am, and I share that story with my kids, and they want to go have the same experience. Moments like those shape who you are.
It was I believe, the main resource for this area, and that was harvesting of eels.
So you don't really see that at all?
No, not anymore. Only because, the main reason being is that the numbers just aren't there anymore, and so it's not sustainable. It really hasn't changed my connection to the place, because I've got whakapapa around here. My ancestors been born and raised here, so that will never change. You do witness and feel a bit saddened by the fact that it's not the way that it was. I first noticed it probably going back 20 years now by the type of fish species that we would catch in the lake. It wasn't, and it's not uncommon now and again to catch fish that have lesions on them, or they have sores on them, and obviously by looking at the type of fish that you catch and you see that, you know that something's not healthy.
Yeah, there was an imbalance inside of in regards to the sediment. You know, it's like the blood flowing through our veins. It goes a certain way because that's the way that we were created. And it's exactly the same when you look at the moana. It was blocked. The artery was blocked. My own opinion is that as soon as you block that last that's when things started to become an issue.
We tried to get this conservation order on Wairarapa Moana. We explored all along the eastern border, looking at the devastation that had been caused due to farming. Farmers wanted the land drained for farming, and we heard the Maori side. Yeah, it was a real battle that we didn't win, actually. And they diverted the Ruamahanga River.
If you look at that 1946 map, which I show everybody, you'll see that there was a big delta being developed where that comes in. So I believe much of the sediment was deposited in Lake Wairarapa.
Well, the diversion that happened in the 60s changed the channel of the Ruamahanga River, and previously that would have come into the top of the lake and then drained out from the bottom. Now a lot of that water bypasses.
I went to a primary school that was full of farming kids. The whole diversion scheme was designed to allow them to farm. But I grew up with a fisherman, and he hated the diversion scheme because it diverted a lot of sediment from naturally settling out here in Wairarapa Moana. It diverted it straight into Cape Palliser. I grew up with my dad telling me we've lost kelp beds due to the sediment that now naturally used to be in the big floods.
The lake used to flood from 68 square kilometres to 210 square kilometres, and then back to 68 square kilometres. What happened was that suspended sediment went across the land.
Because the land was mainly surrounded by wetlands, that water slowed down and allowed the sediment to settle out.
Which has created this fertile space that we can farm.
It would be really fascinating to see what this lake and what these rivers look like before deforestation and before the wetlands were converted as, were viewed as a waste. Wetlands are a waste. We can quite easily drain those and turn them into viable working land. And that's the goal, and there's, the aftermath of that is what we're seeing here.
Humans had once again interrupted things. What was a pretty vibrant and pretty varied set of ecosystems had been turned into rough grazing. And that really wasn't much good.
When the diversion happened, farming was happening in the catchment around, and a lot of the sediment that was coming into Wairarapa Moana was coming from that farming. And so when we diverted the Ruamahanga, it went into Onoki, and that's where the sediment went. But it left all the old sediment that had been coming through all those farming practices here in Wairarapa Moana.
I've heard farmers saying, oh, it's okay, that stuff goes into the wetland anyway, and it's not a problem. But I know that the phosphorus can bind to the sediment, and there's a capacity issue there as well.
Sediment is a natural part of the system. It's well forested. If it's not, those systems can get choked with sediment that reduce the light penetration into the water column. Sediment that's been washed in there can get resuspended, particularly when the wind stirs it up, like you see in Lake Wairarapa. And so that can have this secondary effect in the environment.
The old sediment that's sitting in the Wairarapa Moana is not healthy. It's got nitrogen and phosphorus attached to it, and so when it's resuspended, it's creating these imbalances in Wairarapa Moana.
So what's it doing wrong? When it's suspended, the light's not coming through. You can't grow anything in there if there's no light. And in order for it to be a habitat for fish, it needs plants. And so what do? What if we grew plants outside of the lake, and they were plants that grew in water called macrophytes? And then you take those macrophytes and you put them into the lake. Now what could happen is that those plants could hold down the soil. So the very nutrients that could be poisoning the water, the very sediment that's suspended, should all be tied down by plants.
It's allowing our environment to do what it does, like for our rivers to expand in certain times of the year. There's a reason for that, and that's what our people did once upon a time.
Yes, we just don't get it. Don't get the interactions between all these things that make the system happen. And the whole lake's like that. The whole lake is one big interwoven mat that creates what we see. But each of those bits of weaving is something in its own right. The Ducks Unlimited folk came up one day and said, we've got an idea. And their idea was to get to work with some large machines, scrape a lot of weeds out of the way, turn some of this rough grazing into shallow wetlands, and with the soil that they'd moved, they would take that as a place to plant up.
We are an environmental group. Our mission statement is the creation and enhancement of wetland for waterfowl. In years gone by, one of our past presidents had his own bulldozer, and he would travel a good distance in the lower North Island anyway, creating wetland for people, private owners.
I actually have a farm further south from here, not very far away, 15 kilometres southeast of here, and we would have 20 wetland areas on that farm.
But the runoff from the farmland is polluting the waterways. Now, if you slowed the runoff down in the form of a dam or a wetland, the more you slow it down, the more that gets absorbed by aquatic plants, vegetation, insects, and just by slowing it down so it can't reach the waterways fast, it does a huge job.
I think Lake Wairarapa's issues are predominantly sediment, but nutrients are a matter. So fencing off waterways, trying to take sediment out, but minimising nitrate is probably the biggest help a flatland farm can do to Lake Wairarapa. It's more in the mountains and the country farms where the sediment comes from.
I think, the farmers that I know in the area are very keen on seeing the land be healthy and diverse. Over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, much greater interest in restoring bush or restoring other native habitats. So they would be in control of how the restoration goes. There's just a common desire to sort of leave the land in a healthy state, and a recognition that maybe some of the farming practices of 100 years ago went a bit too far in clearing land that isn't really that suitable for farming.
A lot of farmers are forming water hubs around river areas in their environment, planting up wetland areas, because 90% of our wetlands were destroyed over time. Farmers are busy restoring these wetland areas. And despite what people say about farmers, they do care about clean water, and they're doing something about it.
When you sit down and talk to them and work with them, they do acknowledge that there is an environmental effect from their farms, and as you've seen at Kawaiwai, and that's not the only one, they've put in wetlands to try and reduce their impact, their environmental footprint.
Yes, we understand we're part of it, the solution, and we do our bit while trying to stay in business. I'm part of a farm discussion group where we meet once a month and discuss all the farming issues, as I have a role with Dairy New Zealand. We've spent quite a bit of time understanding the issues, but it's part of my role is to actually share that knowledge with others. They all actually want to do the right thing, but they're trying to actually establish themselves and make a living. So there's a lot more happening, but I think it's also now been driven by the market as well. And I think we're adding value to our product because it's actually a story that goes with it that people want to know. And you can see there is sediment in there, so I do come along with a tractor and actually take it out sometimes. The regulations nowadays, I'm not sure what I'm allowed to do. What I would say is if you're building something like this, you want to design an element at the start as a sediment trap. You've got which a sediment trap is just slowing water down so sediment falls out. Obviously it's not all the water on the farm, but it's actually giving you a design that with a proven result that if you've got a corner of your farm, as long as you divert some of the water in there and create similar conditions, you would get the same result.
So we partnered with the Wario Wetland Restoration Trust, who started doing planting over probably 12 or 13 years ago. They invited the university to come along in what they called Stage 3, which is the third paddock of about 5 hectares, because their vision was to restore a kahikatea wetland swamp forest. But Lake Wairarapa is very big, and this has only been happening for a few years, so we can't say that, suddenly the lake now has less sediment than it used to, but I'm sure we are capturing, this wetland system is capturing some sediment that would have otherwise ended up there, and if we can replicate this around the majority of the water of the lake with either restored wetlands or even newly constructed wetlands, then I think with a sort of 20-year time frame we can reduce the sediment inputs into the lake.
We were particularly lucky when we started that project 20-something years ago that we formed a local committee of those who were interested. Gunn out there was one of them, Tony Silbury was another. These two guys, they had a huge amount of knowledge, and they were at nearing the end of their working life. So if they got in trouble, They didn't particularly care. So that eased our way a lot.
Yeah.
Without that, it still may not have been possible.
The original attempt to drain that land and convert it into pasture was a total failure. And when we were talking about restoring it, some people were saying, oh, you can't modify the wetland. And we said it is already a hugely modified piece of land.
My opinion on the word restore has changed since being in this role. Restore is usually seen as something is bad and we want to make it better, and that there's a straight line and we would expect to see things getting better as a straight line on a graph. Well, what's the goal? Where are we aiming for? What do we want that to look like? And when you sit down and you talk with all the different partners of the project, everyone has a really different idea of what that looks like.
If we could get it functioning again in the way in terms of the things in the soil, hoping that in the long term a lot of those processes can return. To me, that would be then restoring it. That's one thing always amazes me about New Zealand ecology, is if you can take the pressure off it, it comes away again, which is good. You don't necessarily have to transport things back. You just take those pests off and it just bounces away.
I think it's a real mistake to take my experiences in my generation is a mistake to think that that's what the environment is, because maybe 2 generations ago this whenua of ours, these waters of ours, looked very, very different. And so you have to apply the stories of our past to really understand what we've lost. And we have to engage our imagination, unfortunately, to kind of get a vision of what a healthy environment in Aotearoa looks like.
My children can't do what I can do in our awa and our moana. We could still swim in certain parts that my mother could swim in when she was a child, when I was a child. Not everything, their experiences were totally different to ours. Like we couldn't do what they could do, but we could still do some of the things that they could do. But now, when I look at it, my children can't do anything that I could do.
So my swimming pool was the river when I was a kid. Where I used to swim is now a regular algal bloom, which is poisonous to us and to our dogs and our kids. So instead of going to the river to swim, we go to the swimming pool. And I really don't want that.
I was brought up knowing my connection to the moana. And I hope that I put that into my children. If they were doing this interview, they'd probably say something totally different. But however, the other way, yeah, the other perspective of looking at it is probably, yeah, I think the connection is really different, because touching and feeling and is different to hearing. Yeah.
As a child and even as an adult, we haven't had much to do with Wairarapa Moana itself. And that's a thing that is difficult to accept. Growing up pretty much our whole life speaking about the moana, singing about the moana and doing and learning about the traditions of our moana, but not having any physical kind of connection to it.
I can only speak for my children. I don't, unfortunately, think that they have the same sort of connection to the environment that we did. And I think that's purely because we just grew up we grew up in the environment. That was our norm. We lived by the customs of the sea, collecting kai. That's just how we did. We learnt out here about what was important.
My earliest memories as a child and in my teenage years as well, it wasn't uncommon for the lake to be a blue colour. Now the majority of the time, if it's not a slight murky blue, it's discoloured, i.e. it's dirty. The balance is out of whack at the moment, and I think it will be for many more years to come. But it was definitely a much more productive and even picturesque place to what it was prior to what it is now.
Do you ever remember the lake
I do actually. But that was when I was younger. I do remember it being blue. Yeah, I do remember it. Yeah, I do remember it. Yeah. Which is kind of sad, really. And then it just changed. Yeah. But I don't think I ever noticed it. Like you just asking the question, I never noticed it. I remember it mostly this colour. Yeah. Yeah. That's really sad, eh?
I'm not too sure that they're willing to give it to a group that has no identity connected to the lake. So if nobody cares about the lake, why would they want to give it to it? And so one of the things that as Māori we need to say is we have an identity with the lake, and we want others to think about their identity connected to the lake. One of the things that we have in New Zealand just recently, women's rugby, we had won 5 World Cups that the rest of New Zealand just didn't know about and just didn't care about. They're coming to the World Cup and they were just saying, look, we want to celebrate women's rugby in New Zealand. But what happened was that the Māori women didn't say, oh, we're just going to do these types of things. They were proud of being Māori. They were proud of being Polynesian. They were proud of being New Zealanders. Then in the final, they won. One of the people who was a sensation in terms of the publicity got asked to comment up. She started singing a song. It was a Māori song that we sing in primary schools. Without the words up, the whole state can sing this song. People do appreciate things Māori in New Zealand. And that these strong, they won a rugby game, they won a rugby cup. But they showed the world who New Zealand was. So sometimes when I doubt whether people will come on board of Lake Wairarapa, I think this is a story that we can all know in Wairarapa. Te Remo ngā iwi means that all of the iwi should join, and we should join together and come together. And really what happened was New Zealand came together. They were different iwi, they were different tribes. There was a English tribe, there was a Scottish tribe, and they had all become a New Zealand.
I think it would be taking the entire Rōmahanga catchment, everyone who's involved in that catchment, on the journey with the improvement of Wairarapa Moana.
Needs education. It needs people to know how important this lake is to local Māori, how important it is in terms of the biodiversity of the region.
And that's how you spread the word. You get out, you invite people to sit down and listen to you.
Everyone that lives around the lake is going to have to adapt, is going to have a say.
And connecting people. It's a people problem, this situation we're in. To fix this problem, we need a long-term outlook. We all need to be heading in the same direction.
And it's going to take everybody. It's not going to just take Māori. It's not going to just take the government to make the decision. It's going to take all of us to be on the same waka.
Realise that if a lot of these things have been lost and we weren't able to get it back to the way it once was, but we need to preserve what we have. We need to regenerate what we have, and time's short.
And we can keep on with the stories and the proverbs that go with it, that encourages that meaningful relationship. Our stories are there to be told,
And, you know, they talk about the abundance of kai. So there must be something in there, you know. We should be including, you know, our Māori knowledge in the discussions that we have.
Community, collaboration, valuing of Indigenous perspectives and knowledge.
Understand the voice, first of all, the voice of the Moana, and then to work with the Moana to come up with the solutions for the Moana.
It's going to be generations as well. It's going to be intergenerational. But it's started. You make a mess of the environment, it's a lot longer. It doesn't take long to mess it up, but it's going to take a long time to turn things around.
But whatever we start now, eventually one day it will, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. And I acknowledge that, but I do think that it can be restored.